On today's show, Michael Porter Jr. has hit a wall following his breakout stretch to start the season. What is causing his recent struggles, and will they impact how teams view him as a trade target? I'll answer that on today's episode of Locked On Nets.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to Locked On Nets, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Now the number one sports podcast network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. Thank you for making me your first listen of the day. The show is 100% free on all those great platforms. And on today's episode, I got C.J. Holmes of the New York Daily News joining me. We're going to talk about Michael Porter Jr. We're going to talk about some of his recent struggles, what is causing them, how we think they could or not impact his trade market, and how we think ultimately the Nets are going to handle him as an asset moving into the offseason. Let's go. And joining the show now, we got C.J. Holmes of the New York Daily News. And C.J., we're both snowed in, got hit with like 2 feet of snow, both of us here in Jersey, but Locked On Nets goes on, and we still got more Nets basketball to talk about. And I want to talk about Michael Porter Jr. today because Michael Porter Jr. had kind of been the belle of the ball in terms of the Nets for the first half of the season. He was playing at an all-star level, and we've seen a pretty significant dip in production as of late, and that has coincided with a pretty significant Nets skid that has brought them towards the top of the draft lottery standings. But first, I want to get your reaction to that game last night. What do you think about that game? It looked like the Nets were in control, and then one of the more epic collapses that I've seen in my time on the Nets beat. But what was your reaction to that closing stretch yesterday?
I mean, I'm just not surprised, man. At this point in the season, we've seen that kind of performance from the Nets time and time again this season. And like you said, I never quite heard it put this way, but MPJ is the belle of the ball, right?
That was a Lucas Kaplan phrase that I stole from him.
But yeah, man, as he goes, so do the Nets. And he was just as quiet as anyone else on the court over that final, 8 or so minutes last night. In terms of the tanking goal, that was a very quality, very ethical loss last night. But again, when it comes to finding new and creative ways to lose, I've seen it all.
And
broken.
As you said, MPJ was as quiet as anybody down the stretch, and we'll get into that. I talked about that, the clutch deficiencies a little bit on my recent on my pod yesterday. But just talking about MPJ for the season, I mean, over his first 28 games, if you look at the numbers, he was legitimately playing like one of the most efficient offensive players in the league. He was at 26 points. And he was shooting, 50% from the field, 41% from three. And then over these last 16 games is when we've really started to see a dip in production. Over these last 16 games, he's at 21.7 points, and he's down to 42.4% from the field and 30% from three. And the Nets are 2-14 during that span. And you just put it, you said, as MPJ goes is kind of how the Nets go. They are not able to obviously overcome bad performances from him. And this recent stretch has been, it's been a big drop in production, obviously, from MPJ. And with that, the Nets' ability to compete has kind of, dropped off a cliff. And you look at it, MPJ got snubbed from the All-Star game. I think a lot of people, including myself, agree that that was a snub. But you look at it, since that point, the production has really dipped. And for me, I don't really think that there's been too much that has changed in terms of the process of how MPJ is playing. I think that he's been a really tough shot maker, and a lot of those shots were going in during the first half of the season. A lot of those shots haven't been dropping, over these last 16 games. When you assess this recent stretch, what do you see as the reason for this dip in production? And does this recent stretch change how you view his season overall? And do you think that it will change how other teams view him when they kind of look at him as a prospective trade target?
Yeah, I mean, this doesn't diminish the season that MPJ has had. The numbers collectively, throughout the entire season are still strong. You looked at his past 16. I'm looking at his past 10 right now. Overall field goal percentage is down, but, it's really just the three-point shot that's bringing down his percentages. I mean, he's still making his twos at a 58.6% clip. Rebounds are still up. still averaged 3.5 assists per game, which is, more than you think from a wing whose sole responsibility is to score. But overall, what's causing this dip in production? I mean, I don't think it's injury. I do think there's a little bit of maybe how do I like to put this, like motivational struggles here, right? This might have been MPJ's best chance he'll ever have in his career to make an all-star game, and he didn't get that nod. I think a lot of people want to point to the Nets' record as to why he didn't get that nod, but the point I'm making is, over the first, 2/3 of the season, that was probably his biggest like internal driver. Like, he knew this team wasn't going to the playoffs. The team made it clear that they're not trading him at this time. So, different things get guys going, and I'm not in MPJ's head, but I would imagine that working towards that all-star berth was a big goal of his. And now that that's over, now that we're in the home stretch, maybe there's a dip in motivation, right? Another thing is just like where he's getting his shots from, right? Nolan Ferrari started like 11, 12 games in a row at this point. The Nets' offense is different with them out there. They're a little less reliant on MPJ to create offense because, Nolan has taken strides in that regard, and he's setting guys up and getting guys open looks. Another thing is like you established, MPJ is a tough shot maker, right? And tough shot makers are streaky, right? They're, that's just law, right? And, right now some of those tough looks aren't going down. But another thing you got to point out is he's, when he's out there with Nolan, he's not really, the amount of tough looks that he's forced to take is now significantly less, right? Maybe his looks are getting a little cleaner, he's getting the ball in different places, and with that comes adjustment. So, overall, it is what it is. Nets are slogging through the end. I don't want to say MPJ's checked out or anything, but I mean, let's be honest. Like, what would you do in this situation?
Yeah, it's human nature. And I think that you made a great point about the All-Star, because we know that did mean something to MPJ. Like, he said that to us flat out. And you kind of you have that to look forward to as kind of the thing that you're working towards. And with that being in the rear view, that's one less motivating factor. And then you add in the fact that he's on a tanking team. I mean, all these tanking teams, like, the season really starts to drag along. Trust me, I know that doing a podcast every day about this team, it starts to drag once you get into this last third of the season. And for MPJ, I definitely think that that's a factor. I did think that, we're talking about a 16-game sample. I do think early on, and for most of that, I think there has been a difference in the engagement that you've seen from him, overall during that stretch versus in the beginning of the season. Because we did see, during the beginning of the season, he was working hard for a lot of buckets on the interior. Like, he was getting those slips, those backdoor cuts, those high-low actions. I actually think that we saw a few more of them during the game against Atlanta. But yeah, you said, he's still shooting pretty decently from two. Over those first 28 games, he was at 58% on 9.3 attempts per game. Over these last 16, he's at 56% on 8.6. So it's dipped a little bit. The volume has dipped very slightly, but you also said it's really been the three-point shooting. Like, he's gone from, 41% from three to 30% from three. And if you look at the three-point looks, before we did the show, I went on Synergy and looked at, his last 10 games, all the three-point looks that he's taken. There's some open ones, but him getting a wide open three-point look, very, very rare. I mean, there's a lot of really difficult looks in there. And like you said, when you take that volume of really difficult looks, at a certain point, the law of averages was going to hit. The fact that he was shooting 41% over a near 30 game sample on the difficulty level of looks that he was getting, it was pretty unbelievable. I was left at a loss for words. So I'm not surprised that it's cooling off. But I think that, I've gotten some Nets fans in my comments who have been concerned and said, they should have moved off of him at the deadline. They should have done that. This is now going to affect his trade value. I'm not really sure that I agree with that, but what is your take on that? Do you think that this will, going into the offseason, have an impact on how teams are viewing him? Or do you think the overall body of work and the larger body of work during the beginning of the half of the season will, take precedent?
Yeah, man. I mean, I think the overall body of work takes precedent. And then if you just look at these, if you just look at percentages aside, if you just look at the numbers, right? I mean, we just last month, this dude had 3 30-point games in 4 games. You know what I'm saying? I don't necessarily think it's going to affect his trade value. I think, as long as he's relatively healthy, which he has been throughout the year, I don't think that's going to scare, other teams off this offseason or anything like that. And I think other teams are also like conscious of like the situation that he's in, right? You're never like quite judging a guy for like what he's doing in that system. It's about what he can do in our system, right? When you're looking to bring a guy in. So it's just a matter of how the Nets value him, right? The Nets see him as part of their future, and to fit alongside this presumed lottery pick that they have coming up here. And that's the thing. I don't think the Nets are in like any rush to make any decisions on MPJ right now. Yeah, I mean, like, you and I both know their main goal is to maintain, strategic financial flexibility in terms of building this roster going forward. So, I don't think the Nets are going to like rush to like try to extend them or anything like that. They're going to see how the draft plays out, see how the roster looks after free agency and stuff, reassess MPJ's value, and then, decide his future from there. Because the thing is that Brooklyn's in control right now. And as we saw at the trade deadline, Sean Marks is getting bullied into dealing this dude for anything less than what they perceive he's worth. So it's a great situation for the Nets. And, regardless of the results of the season, this has been a good season for Michael Porter Jr. because he's been able to show the entire NBA what he's capable of as a featured number one option.
Yeah, I think over the overall body of work, it's definitely been a win for the Nets. That trade looks like a home run. And unless he just falls off a cliff in a massive way over the rest of the season, I do think that first half of the season is going to be the thing that really sticks in people's mind with how he's playing, because that obviously is like, for tanking teams, the meaningfulness of basketball games from a winning perspective really starts to fade, obviously, as the season goes on. But there is an aspect of Michael Porter Jr.'s game that I do think is significant in terms of how other teams might be viewing him and how the Nets are viewing him, and that is his clutch performance. So I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about what is the Nets' overall strategy? Like you just touched on it briefly, but how do they move forward? How do they kind of view him? Is he an extension candidate? Is he a trade guy? So we'll get into all that when we continue Locked On Nets after a quick break. Workplace chaos, deadlines stacking up, inbox overflowing, and the one position you have to fill still sitting open. When the pressure's on and you need that right hire, that's a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Indeed Sponsored Jobs help you reach the people who actually fit what you're looking for. Skills, experience, location. So you're not just hoping the right candidate stumbles across your post. And here's the stat that says it all. In the minute I've been talking to you, companies like yours made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Less stress, less time, more results. When you need the right person to cut through the chaos, that's a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to help get your job the premium status it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? That's a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. All right, coming back from the break here on Locked On Nets, got C.J. Holmes of the New York Daily News here, and we're talking about Michael Porter Jr. And I said, we both said that we feel like his recent dip in production, which has been over these last 5-6 weeks, 16 games, it's been noticeable. I don't think that in the grand scheme of things, it's that big of a deal or that teams are going to take that much away from it. But there is a bigger sample of performance over the whole season that I do think some teams might read into, and the Nets might read into, and that is his clutch performance. Because you look at Nets, you look at Michael Porter Jr., I talked about this on last night's episode. As you said, CJ, like he was completely invisible down the stretch of that game against the Hawks. And that has been the case in more than a few, games, tight games this season for the Nets. And his overall clutch performance, over 65 clutch minutes, he shot 12 of 38 from the field. That's 31.6%. 4 of 24 from three. That's 16.7%. He's got 2 assists and 4 turnovers. So the clutch, performance, the clutch production has not been there. And for me, that is a bigger deal to me. If you're talking about, can this guy MPJ be a number 2 option? I never thought he was going to be a number 1 guy, but people always have those conversations when somebody performs as he did in the first half of the year. But if you're talking about, can he be more than he was in Denver? I do think that these clutch numbers, they do say something, because, you need guys who you're going to pay at that level as one of the highest paid guys on your team to step up in those situations. For MPJ, it's been kind of stepping out of the shadow of Jokic and Murray and some of those guys And can he handle some of those main guy responsibilities? And Wall, he's in a difficult situation with not another high-level scorer around him and a lot of Nets rookies. He hasn't really been up to that task down the stretch of games, and that's not surprising to me, given some of the limitations in his skill set or the archetype of player he is. But what do you make of those clutch struggles, and how do you think that can impact kind of what teams think he can be in terms of the hierarchy of their situations?
Eric, I think it's a little misleading, right? Early on in the year, when the Nets were still in contention, or whatever you want to call it, even though they started over 7, we'll get to that later. But that early in the year before the season was, dubbed completely over. We saw MPJ delivering some clutch moments, but you got to think of this from like a strategic standpoint for the other team. Other teams know that in the fourth quarter, really MPJ is the only one who can hurt them. So of course they're going to do everything in their power to force him into turnovers and send multiple volleys at him and make sure he doesn't get clean looks and make Yegor Demon and Nolan Traore beat them, which, closing out games has been a mixed result for both of those guys this year, right? So, yes, the clutch numbers may be down like recently, but like I wouldn't consider, I don't know, it's just hard to judge because these aren't like high stake basketball games for this team. They're not playing for anything. I want to see how an MPJ performs when the Nets are, one day, I don't know, throwing out numbers like 34 and 17 at this time of the year or something, like, what I'm saying? But I do think that down the stretch of these games, Porter's impact has been minimalized simply because, teams understand that this is the only guy that can hurt us, and we're going to take him out the game at whatever cost. And when they do that, you get performances like you got over the final 8 minutes yesterday.
Yeah, but I think that says something about, his skill set. And look, I need to say, like, flat out, like, you're right. Like, you can't just kill him for it and, read fully into it.
It's so hard to judge him in this.
No, I agree with you.
I
have to fully, put in the caveat that he's playing alongside 2 rookies and Nick Claxton and Noah Clowney, none of which are high-level shot creators. Like, we know that he's going to work best off of another, like, lead ball handler type guy. And look, I was never a person who said that MPJ was going to be like a number 1 option on a good team. I always thought that he was going to be someone who works better off of that true lead ball handler. And I think that he's proven that he can do that with some ancillary shot creation more than some other people thought. But for me, you do look at, like, it is easier to take him out of a game down the stretch than some other guys. And it is tough because he's not playing alongside that other type of guy. But his player archetype, like the things that he struggles with, he really struggles as a ball handler. Like, that's not a strength of his. He's not a guy who's creating stuff off the dribble, really. And then also, he struggles in terms of being a guy who can kind of create separation just due to some of the, like, quick twitch athletic limitations that he has in addition to that ball handling stuff. So I don't think that it's like an indictment of him or anything, but I think if you're saying, can this guy scale up from being like maybe the number 3 that he was in Denver to that top 2 type option, you need to have some shot creation as one of those top 2 guys on the ball. You need to be able to beat double teams and do some of those other things. Like, you look around the league, all of these guys who are a top 2 option on a team, they can go get you a bucket off the dribble or do some things along those lines where they can be a self-creator down the stretch of games. And that's where I doubt a little bit whether or not MPJ can do that. And, that's shown in the Nets clutch record. I mean, they're 5-19 in the clutch. That's the worst record in the league. And they have the 2nd worst clutch offensive rating in the league. So I don't think it's an indictment of MPJ. I still think he's had a great season. I just think it does bring in questions about whether or not he can be like that top 2 guy on a good team because of some of the limitations he has. But I also want to talk about how we think the Nets are going to handle MPJ this coming offseason, because I do think there's going to be a lot more trade conversations around him. There's also going to be extension conversations because he's eligible for an extension in July. So when you kind of weigh those different paths that the Nets could go, whether trading him or whether giving him an extension, does one of those seem like the more prudent route to you based off of what we've seen from him?
Yeah, I mean, I reiterate what I said earlier. I mean, I think the Nets are in a great no-pressure position where they can just wait and see how things play out in accordance to their off-season plans, right? If you're going to extend them early, because of that goal of wanting to maintain, financial, flexibility, it's got to be something team-friendly. Is MPJ cool with that? Does he really think that this is his home here in Brooklyn, right? I think the more likely option is the wait and see approach. Like I said, wait and see how the draft turns out, wait and see how free agency turns out, and then reevaluate MPJ's place on the roster from there. But then again, if there's a offer out there that blows Sean Marks away, right? And say you landed AJ I can never say his name, man. If you land AJ DeBanza or Aaron Peterson, that changes things, right? Then it's no longer, then like you said, then it becomes, can MPJ play off these guys, right? Can these guys be successful together, right? So, yeah, man, I think the Nets are going to be patient. I don't think they're rushing into any extension until they can, evaluate more things. But like I said, then again, if there's an offer that's on the table, for a desperate contender that just needs a scoring punch, I could see the Nets pulling the trigger too. But, the point I'm trying to make is like everything is fluid right now, especially when it comes to APJ. And there's not necessarily a rush. Obviously they value him to a certain extent that they didn't just flip him at the trade deadline a couple weeks ago. But I think that this is going to be something that's evaluated kind of month-to-month evaluation kind of thing.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you that they're not in a rush. And I think that we've seen a lot of similarities in the messaging and how they've approached this situation to Cam Johnson last season. Because last year at the trade deadline, the things that I had heard were, Cam, the Nets aren't actively shopping Cam. They're listening to offers. They're comfortable holding him through the trade deadline. The same kind of messaging I heard about MPJ at this trade deadline. They have a really high asking price, maybe 2 first-round picks, similar to what we heard with Cam. And you look at how that Cam situation played out. They saw where they landed in the draft. They evaluated, and they traded him on, I think June 30th or July 1st after the draft. So I think that, landing in the lottery, I wouldn't expect to see any significant Nets moves until they know what their lottery spot is and until they know what kind of player they're going to be coming away with. But if I'm just talking about the MPJ extension, like, I don't at all mind like MPJ as a player. I think he's proven that he can be he can be an impactful player for a title team. He won a championship already. For me, it's more about the timeline. Does he fit it? And the opportunity cost of keeping him. Like, what can you get? Because if this is the point this offseason where you think his value is higher than it's ever going to be, unless you feel that he's somebody who can really boost you in like the short to medium term and be a bridge guy who impacts the development very positively of some of the rookies you have, then you can keep him. But otherwise, I'd be wary about giving him an extension, just given the fact that I think this might be the peak of his value, the injury history, the timeline. And there's other guys that maybe you can go after who fit the timeline that might be a better allocation of some of the money, the cap space, the assets that you can have. And then you also have to weigh in the fact, going after those guys, you also get the stuff that you trade for MPJ, which I think is not going to be insignificant. So we'll see how that plays out. But I want to close the show out with some NBA draft talk because CJ was down in Washington, D.C. in his old stomping grounds and got a firsthand look at Cam Boozer and also some players on Michigan during that highly contested Duke-Michigan battle. So what we see from some of those guys, what are CJ's thoughts on some of those top draft prospects? We'll get into all that when we close out Locked On Nets after a quick break. Ever wanted to experience the NBA Finals live and in person? FanDuel is giving you the chance to turn that dream into reality with their NBA sweepstakes. Here's how it works. Use your profit boost on any NBA future, and you'll automatically be entered for a shot to win a trip to the NBA Finals for 2. That's right. Flights, tickets, the whole experience. Guys, if you're already looking at the standings and thinking about which team can make a deep run come playoff time, this is the perfect time to lock in. You'll love futures this time of year, whether it's picking a team to win the championship or grab a conference title. It adds that extra layer of excitement to every game down the stretch. And now, not only can your pick cash, but it can also send you to the finals. So visit FanDuel.com to get started. Use your profit boost on an NBA future and get entered for your chance to win a trip to the NBA Finals. Play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, coming back from the break, closing out today's Locked On Nets episode, got C.J. Holmes of the New York Daily News here. And C.J., you were down in D.C. You got to go to that Duke-Michigan game. And you got a firsthand look at Cam Boozer, who I talked recently about on the pod with the draft analyst, who actually had Boozer number 2 on his board and said that he might have had him ahead of Cooper Flagg on his board on last year's draft. So there's a lot of buzz surrounding this guy. You got a firsthand look at him in person. Just what were your thoughts on what he was able to do and kind of what he can bring to the table for an NBA team?
Yeah, I mean, like, the kid's a silent killer and he's a bully. I'll tell you that. Wasn't my first impressions, walking to the arena, seeing him in layup lines, is just like how massive he is. I know that's like, relative, compared to like, NBA bodies and stuff. But in terms of the college level, he passes the eye test. He's a man among boys. And I really just like how physical he is in the paint. Michigan is the best rebounding team in the country. Duke destroyed them on the glass. Boozer was a big part of that. He wasn't too flashy, right? And I think that speaks volumes about like, the job Michigan did on him defensively, at least for like most of the game. But it's just like, how to put this? He's just like, he's good at clearing out space and holding that space and using his body to create around the rim, much like his father. Didn't see too much from him in terms of like jump shooting. He didn't do a lot of that against Michigan. He did a lot of his work in the paint. However, I was impressed with his ability to pass the basketball. And that's the thing, because of, I have some insider information, and this is probably obvious, right? But Michigan went into that game saying, we're not going to double this kid. However, he was so physical inside and getting easy buckets inside that at a certain point you had no choice but to. And when that happened, that's when you started seeing Isaiah Evans getting like loose for three and stuff like that. When you got Boozer kind of working as that central hub in the offense, in the high key, kind of just catching it, facing, and just really spraying the open shooters, right? And to be a, four who can create like that, I mean, it's really impressive. I definitely think hype is justified. Is he my number one on my big board? No, I still think Ada and Darren have a leg up in that regard. I do worry about Boozer's athleticism. I know that's like, something a lot of folks have talked about, but like you didn't really see anything that wowed you athletically outside of his like, size. But, he knows how to make the most of what he does have. And I just Pops was loving it. He was watching courtside.
Yeah, and you said like nothing flashy. Like what I've seen of him,
it's just ethical, fundamental.
Bro, the way I would describe it, he's got a little bit of like the old man at the Y game. And I'm not saying that he's like unathletic or whatever, but he's just a guy who like consistently makes the right play. Like he clears out space in the post. Like you said, he'll make the right read and pass the ball. He's not the most athletic leaper or mover, but he'll be in the right spot on defensive rotations. Like he just does all of those things well. And that's why I feel like there might be a disconnect between like the common casual fan and people who really follow this stuff in terms of like, he's not going to be anywhere near the most entertaining highlight tape that you're going to see out of these top draft guys. But in terms of the impact, like if you look at the metrics, I was looking at it the other day in terms of, BPM, like plus minus, he's at like a 19 and the next highest player in the country is like a 13. Like he is far and away in terms of all of the metrics. He's going to be the number one guy on the draft board in terms of all of those different metrics. But like you said, there are questions about, he's not really center sized. Is he going to be big enough to guard centers? Is he going to be athletic enough to guard centers? Is he going to be quick enough to guard fours? But for me, man, like he just looks like an ethical hooper, as you put it, definitely. And, just a very talented and smart kid. So I think that he's definitely going to be in contention to be, pushing up towards the number one pick. I think it'll matter team to team. The medicals with DP will matter and some of those other stuff. But last thing, that Michigan team, you do have some connections there. Some guys, and they got a couple of draft guys on that team, Yaxel Lundenberg and some other guys. So anything that you've heard about those guys or just what you saw from them in that game?
I mean, it was all Yax early in the game. I think he scored he had like 12 points in like 4 minutes, and then like he had like 15 at halftime. But the thing with Yax is like he's versatile, he defends, he's athletic, he runs the floor. He can do a lot of the stuff in terms of like, in terms of facilitating that Boozer can do, right? I think the swing skill for Yax is going to be his 3-point shooting, because when his threes were going down in that Duke game, he was unguardable. So I think Yax is like definitely first round pick, maybe like late lottery or just outside the lottery. But when it comes to the University of Michigan, the dark horse is that, what's his name? Johnson Jr., the center? Yeah, Morez Johnson Jr. I love, like, he's a center, super athletic. A lot of, like, both of the centers, man. Both of those Michigan centers. God, the other one is, what's his name?
Yeah, a day Mara.
Yeah, dude, both of those centers, they're just so good defensively, and they're so good at, like, hunting shots and hunting rebounds and hunting blocks, and, like, they're both guys that, like, if they get it, like, within 5 feet, probably gonna go in. So I was really impressed with those guys. But yeah, I think that kind of, like, rounds up the guys coming out on Michigan this year. They obviously got some young guards who still got a little bit of time left at the college level, but Michigan's a team that's ran by their front court, which makes it even more impressive that Boozer was able to get the best of them on a neutral site. And when we talk about Boozer's impact, here's the last thing: at the under 4 timeout on the floor, Duke scored on every possession in the game. Boozer touched it every time.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, that says it about him. And on those other guys, yeah, like, Yaxel might not really be in the Nets range, but they have a lot of other draft picks. You never know. Maybe they could get in for a second lottery pick. And the other 2 centers that you spoke about, Johnson and Mara, those guys, on the ESPN's big board right now, they're 32 and 41. And those are, like, right almost exactly around where the Nets second round picks are going to be. So those guys could have some significance. We'll see how the Nets handle their center position. Maybe they're trying to backfill through the draft. We'll obviously keep tabs on all that. But CJ, appreciate taking the time. Good talk on MPJ. The Nets maybe will play tomorrow. We'll see. They're stuck in Atlanta right now. Probably should have mentioned that earlier. They're stuck in Atlanta. The Mavs are stuck in Indianapolis. But hopefully they can get back, and, we'll have a lot more Nets talk moving forward. And I'm sure we'll circle back and have you on the show again, Bert. Appreciate you taking the time, man. That does it for today's episode of Locked On Nets. Hope you guys enjoyed the talk with CJ. If you do not already, make sure to subscribe to Locked On Nets on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you enjoy my content, take a second right now, smash that like button, leave a comment, leave a 5-star review. Anything you can do to engage is much appreciated. But the Nets are supposed to be back in action on Tuesday. We'll see if the game is ultimately played. But regardless, I will be back tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.